Hello and welcome to today's FinSuite Plus session on securing your endpoints in Xano. My name is Ruairi. I'm a WWX developer here at FinSuite, and today I'm going to be showing you how to protect your Xano endpoints from malicious attackers. Today we're going to look at how we can secure endpoints in Xano so that we don't have any unauthorized use on our Xano account. We only want people to be able to do what we have designed the web app to do. We don't want people to be able to hack into it or to use an endpoint that they shouldn't be allowed to use. So we'll take a look at that. Quickly cover some terminology here. We'll have people here with different levels of experience using this tech stack and using API endpoints. So Webflow, Wized, and Xano, you're likely all familiar with already. Webflow we use for building the front end. Xano we use for the back end, and Wized is essentially the bridge in between the two of them. So Xano, we can call a backend as a service, which is a pretty new term to me, but that's what we call the likes of Xano, Supabase, Firebase, all of these tools where we can pay a monthly fee and we get a backend for our web app without having to worry about assigning resources or DevOps or keeping the server up. We're paying for that. That's the service that we're getting. Then we have APIs, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And these essentially allow different pieces of software, different web apps to communicate with each other. So if you take SendGrid as an example, or Mailgun, which is used for sending emails, you log in to set up your account to create your emails, that sort of thing. When you build your web app and you connect it to SendGrid or Mailgun, you use their API to send requests. So there'll be an API to send an email, and you can send information to that API. Here's the email I want to send to, here's the template I want to use, and off it goes. That's what APIs do. REST APIs are a type of API. So different types of APIs have different rules and different standards and formats that they follow. So GraphQL is an example of an API standard or type that you might have heard before. REST is just another particular one that we use in Wized. So when we're inside of Wized and we are creating apps, we have a couple of app options, and REST just means that we want to work with a REST API. And the handy thing about that is we can use any service that has a REST API. We don't need to have a built-in app like we do Firebase or Supabase. These are very handy and we can use them. But this REST API app is what's going to allow you to connect and use any REST API because they all follow the same standard and format. Makes them interoperable across all our different web apps. And then lastly, we have a Xano API endpoint, and that's just the specific way that we make API endpoints on Xano. They use REST APIs, so they follow REST API standards, as we'll see shortly. So I'll just quickly cover the terminology and introduce you to APIs if you're not too familiar with them. They're basically the backbone of any web app. So we're typically going to have our front end. We'll have some sort of logic in between, typically Wized in this case. And then the backup is typically, or the back end, is typically going to have a database and API endpoints that you can use to communicate into the app and out of it. Before we actually go into Xano, we'll very briefly touch on security, which is the whole purpose of what we're doing here. And there's a lot to security, but 3 points to keep in mind when you're building web apps are, first of all, to own it and to take responsibility for it. As the developer who's planning out and building this app, front end and back end, security is ultimately your responsibility. The client isn't likely to be an expert on web apps or how to secure them, so it falls on you to test it and to make sure that the app is secure. So this is maybe something that you include as a package deal. It's maybe an add-on that you have that you would do additional testing and security on any web apps that you build. Whatever way you work it in, make sure that you're the one that's looking after it. Then to be proactive and to think about security before there is a security issue. So web app security is a little like installing fire alarms in your house. You have to install them before your house is on fire. And you need to implement security features and security methods, things like authentication, before any of your web apps are hacked. So it's a little like insurance. You need to take care of this before it becomes a problem. And then to just be aware that this is always a threat. Digital security is different to physical security. They're both important and they both need to be implemented. The thing about digital security is attacks can come from anyone, anywhere in the world at any time. Now, it often doesn't feel that way. You may launch a web app and never have any issues. It never gets hacked. No one ever tries to mess with it. And that's just due to the number of web apps and websites out there, right? There's a huge amount. Fairly unlikely that yours is going to be the one that gets hacked, but it is possible. And it can happen when you're in bed. It can happen when you're at work, when you're on the way to work, and it can be done from anywhere in the world. So while, it's maybe less likely that something will happen. For example, where I live, if you don't lock your physical shop, you might go a couple of days before it gets broken into. With web apps, there's a kind of a false sense of security because nothing might happen. It might never get the eyes of a malicious user or a hacker coming across it. But if it does, you have to be set up and prepared in advance. And we're going to look at some of what we can do to secure endpoints and make sure that they don't get attacked or compromised. So with that out of the way, we will jump over into Xano. And the building blocks of what Xano gives us are all over on the left. And these are arguably the two most important ones, the database and the API. So if we go to the API, it's going to let us make API groups, ways of grouping API endpoints together. And these groups then become our apps inside of Wized. So I have one for users here and I have one for animals that match up with these two API groups. So I have a new one here that all it does is it gets a list of animals from the database, and there's also one here for creating a new animal. So REST APIs come with these actions or functions. Every REST API has a type, a resource type. So these will come up if we create a new query. We have the verb, they call it in Xano. We have get, which is typically when you're just getting information from an API endpoint. Post is for sending information, for adding it to a database. Deleting is for deleting a record. Put I don't really use. I think it's to add and update a record at the same time. It's not common. I don't believe you can actually use it in Wized. So the options Wized are going to give us is get, post, patch. Okay, you can actually use put. And we have delete there as well. And head, never used. Not sure what it does, frankly. These are the ones that you're typically going to be using. So with this one that I've created, it's very simple. Doesn't take any inputs. It just queries all records from this database table and returns it down here. So when you create this, what Xano is going to give you, it's going to give you an endpoint URL, which looks like this up in the address bar. And you'll be used to putting these into Wized. So you'll make an app with a base URL and you'll make a request down here and put in your URL endpoint. But the way these work is these can be accessed from any device, any browser, any application. And to demo that, there's two kind of useful tools for working with API endpoints. You have Postman, which is a fairly popular web-based version. And there's one for Apple Mac called Bruno. Not sure if it's available on Windows. I prefer this because it's open source and free and very easy to use, but everybody can use Postman, so we'll work with that for the time being. So in Postman, we can create a new API call. And again, here you'll see our resource types that have to match up. So this URL can be the same. In fact, it might be the same. It is the same URL. We can hit either one of these by using either get or post. So over here, if we use get and we put this in here and we run it, we are going to see our response down here. So it just returns that I only have 4 items in the database, and this is the exact same thing we'll get if we run it over here in Xano. And it's the exact same thing we'll get if we run it over here in Wized. So that's the first kind of paradigm shift to have here, or the first kind of change to your thinking if you're new to Xano, is just understanding that if someone finds this URL, they can use it. And if they get into if they log into your web app and they go into the inspector and they go into the network, they can find these URLs being hit because it's their browser through Wiz that is making these API calls. So that's the first thing to think about, is that, probably someone isn't going to guess this. They could. There's probably a bot out there that's just trying random API points until it gets a success. So first thing to be aware of. Next thing is, what can we do in light of this? So some API endpoints, you might want anybody to be able to access them. That's not necessarily a bad thing. What you want to do is first think about who should be using it. So for example, on your web app, the API endpoint for someone to register and log in, we want those to be publicly accessible so that anybody can create a new account or log in. What we may want to do for this one is only let logged in users make this request. So maybe instead of, just a simple list of animals, maybe this is a database of animals that we only want to be able to people to access on, say, our veterinary website, that you have to register, make a free account to be able to access that information. First step there is we need a database with authentication enabled on it. In any of your tables, if you go into settings, you have the option of enabling authentication. And this is typically just done on your users table, where you store users when they log in and when they register. So we have that enabled here. And once that's enabled, on all of our API endpoints, we're going to get the option to lock them or to require authentication. So if I click into here, I can do this either by clicking the lock at the top, or I can go up to the dots up here, I can go to settings, and I can go to authentication enabled. Other handy thing here is just this external access option. If you turn that to disabled, it means no one can use it externally. So let's actually enable that first, just as an example. So we'll disable that and publish it. And if we try to hit that in Postman, it's going to tell us an error code not found. So if you're just setting up an API endpoint and you're testing it and you don't want anyone to be able to use it, that's your first port of call. So we will enable that and we will turn on user authentication and publish it. Now, over in Postman, if we try to run this request, we are going to get the following: unauthorized authentication required, because we have not told the endpoint that we're logged in. In Xano, if you want to get this to work, so if we run this, it's telling me that that's required. Xano will let you pick a user and just generate an auth token for them. And if we run that in Xano, that is going to work. So this auth token system is something that's provided by Xano, and it's a fully functional authentication system. And one of the benefits to Xano is if you were building, if you were doing your own web app completely locally and you were building this from scratch, you would have to build the authentication system yourself, or you'd have to find some sort of third-party authentication system. And that can open up a lot of vulnerabilities if you don't do it correctly. So big benefit of Xano is that they've given us this authentication system out of the box. It's very robust, very secure. We just have to use it correctly. So again, with Wized, you'll be familiar with how we get around this, how we provide an authentication token. So in my Wized project, I have a cookie for auth token, and I just have a login endpoint where if I log in successfully, it saves an auth token here. And what I would do over in Wized is I would add a header, and I'd call this authorization header, and I would return the authentication token from the cookie. If I run this without doing that, so if I remove that and run this, I'm going to get the same thing. I'm going to get unauthorized authentication required. If I pop in the authentication key, return that, and now I run it. Now it works. Now the endpoint is secure. How we do that in a tool like Postman is we go to authorization. And it's been a while since I've done this in Postman, but I think we want bearer token. And then that token that we got here in Xano, we can just copy out and put it in here and click send. And now we get access. So that's kind of the bare minimum authentication that you can do in Xano. There is another tool that Xano gives you called cores. So if you're inside an API group in Xano, you can go up here to cores management. And if you set this to custom and tick all of these, what this is meant to do is it'll only allow requests to Xano that come from these URLs. This is my web app, and this is the Wized server. The problem is with cores is you can just bypass it. And we'll actually do that as an example. So if I remove these origins, the way I thought this worked when I first started using it is that no one would be able to access your app or your endpoints. And I thought that was the case because when I turned that on and ran this in Wized, that did not work. Yeah, it might take a minute for it to refresh with that 1 minute max age. But basically, it's down to the browser to respect this. So if you try running this in Wized, once this kicks in, it won't let you do it because Wized is respecting that Xano is saying, hey, I only want to receive requests from this address. Problem with that is the likes of Postman can just get around it. You can just not respect that and you can still get data back. So this doesn't really get used. Turn that back to default. So now that we've locked our endpoint, it can only be used by users of our app. What we might want to do then is to break this down into roles. So we might want to have normal users can get a list of animals, but we only want people to be able to post to add to the database if they are an admin. So over in my dashboard, I will go into my users database and I have a row over here for role. And this can either be admin user or standard user. So I'm going to set that to standard for now. And I'll go back to my API, to animals, and into post to create a new pet. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on authentication so that you have to be authenticated to access this endpoint. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on these three endpoints here. Actually, I'm going to make a new one. The first thing I'm going to do is I'll do this from scratch actually. I want to get a record from users. And there's usually kind of two ways we can use this. One is we would pass in an ID from Wized. So if you had a dashboard on the front end for managing users and you wanted to select a particular user, you could click it, send across their ID and edit them that way. The other way we can do this is under field value. So we want to get a record from the users table. The field we want to reference is ID. Under value, there's an option here, auth. And under auth, there's the option for ID. And this is a very, very useful feature in Xano. What this is going to do is in this auth token that we're sending over, when Xano gets that, it knows what user is tied to that token and it knows what their ID is. So Xano will get the ID of the user from the auth token and it will find them based on the auth token. So that means whenever someone uses this, it's going to get the record of the account that they're logging in with because Xano has those two things linked together. So I'm going to call this auth user, which is what I call the user that's being authenticated. And I'm going to put that up the top. And I'm then going to create a precondition where we can check that something is true before proceeding. And what I want to check is I want to check if the authenticated user, if their role is equal to I think I called it admin user. That in there. And I just want to check that that is what I actually called that in the table. Yes. Standard user and admin user. Okay, great. So I'm a standard user at the minute. What I want to do is auth user role equals admin user. Error message, you do this. Nice and simple. And I'm then going to move that up here. And what's going to happen here, if we go up to the top, first of all, authentication is required. Possible inputs are the name of the pet or the animal and the type. So type is an enum. It can be cat, dog, or I think parrot is the other one. Yeah, parrot is there. We get the record of the user that is authenticating on the endpoint, which is done here. We get their ID from their auth token. We check if they're in an admin. If they're not, this fails. If they are, this proceeds. So let's go over and set this up in Postman. We are going to change this from get to post. And we still want to send over our bearer token. And for our params, we want to say, what did we have? We had name and type. Say name. Our name is, I forgot, I don't have squirrel. I have cats, dogs, and parrots to work with. I would just say Bob. And type is dog. Okay. And you'll actually see that I actually put those in the wrong place. Query params is for if you're making a get request. So I actually want to get rid of those. Whoops. I want to add those to the body. I want to send it as unencoded. We'll say name, Bob, and type dog. And send that off. And it created it, which I did not want it to do. So, didn't publish. Typical. Publish the endpoint and then try running it. And it is going to tell us that we do not have permission to do this. And this is a very secure way of doing things in Xano, because the other way you could do this is you could make an input called user or user role and pass it in through Wized, which obviously wouldn't work because then anyone could just add their role as admin. You could use get record and you could pass in an ID of the user and get their role that way. But then if someone found out the ID of a user, they could pass. So, if I had a table reference in here to users and you found out what the ID of my user is, you could pass that in, thereby bypassing the check that we have set up here. So best way to do this for when users are registering on your application is to enable authentication, get the record using this auth and ID, and then do whatever check you want to get. And because this is on the back end, people can't change this logic. If you were doing this kind of logic on Wized, if you were pulling the user into Wized, checking if they had the admin role, and then sending off the information, that can be tampered with. That can be changed since Wized is running on the front end. So any of this logic that we absolutely need users to not be able to change and interfere with, we do on the Xano backend. There's one other way of doing this that's a bit more of a niche use case, but we're going to look at it anyways. And actually what we'll quickly do first is just to show that this works, is we will change my role to admin user. The postman, this Joe, and then click send. And now, because I am a admin in the backend database, the record gets created. So another way we can do this is we look at endpoint over here in use. And in your login endpoint, you will have this function here to create an authentication token, which is what then gets stored in Wized and used for all future requests. There's an option here you may have seen called extras when you're creating an authentication token. So we select the table that we're using for authentication. We select how many seconds that the token is going to last before it expires, and the user that we're creating the authentication token for. This extras allows us to store additional information inside this token that Xano uses. So what we're doing in this endpoint is we're creating a path called role inside that object, and we're setting the value to be user.role. And user here is just whoever logs in. So if I log in and I'm an admin, it's going to save my role of admin_user to the authentication token. And we'll demo that here. So I basically just, this is how your authentication token will typically work. And I went in here and I did set, and I said role as the path, and then the value is user.role. We'll update that and save it. And I'll publish that. Then over in our animals endpoint for this post one, what we can do is we can check if the user's authentication token contains that value. And what we're going to do there is, that's what I had set up here earlier. So I'm going to disable these two. And I'm going to re-enable these two. Oh no, that was cloned. You don't want to clone it, just enable it. 1, 2, 3. So first one is doing the exact same thing as last time. It is getting the user based on the authentication token that is being passed to Xano. The second step is when we are inside the query builder. You remember we looked at auth for getting the record, and we selected the ID. That's the first piece of information that's always in the authentication token. We also have extras, which is where we access that information that we pushed on that role. So the first thing we want to do is we want to check if extras has the path of role, because let's say our standard users don't have any information stored here. If we do a check down here on my previous one, so we want to go extras.role equals admin user. This will fail. This will break if the authentication token doesn't have a role in it. So in my case, I'm not putting this information in for standard users. I'm only doing it for admins. So we first check if that piece of information is there, if the extras object has the role. And then if it does, we want to make sure that that role is equal to admin user. And then if we publish this, and if we run it, and I select myself from here, it shouldn't work because this is an auth token being generated by Xano. It doesn't contain any extra information. So we'll say name is Ted, and we'll say cat, and we'll do run. This is going to say you do not have permission to do this. Now the way I would have to do this is I would have to either set the extras here. So I could just put in role and then admin user. Other thing I could do just to show how this works, how it gets encoded, is I can go over to my user's endpoint to log in, and I can actually just run this here in Xano. I forget what my password was. I'm just going to go change this later. Nothing sensitive stored in there. And that is going to return our authentication token. And although you can't see it, the user role is indeed encoded in here. So then when we go over to our endpoint here, where we have changed the check, we're now not checking the database, we're checking the token for this information. If we paste that in here, the check will succeed. So handy to know about this. It's a bit of a fringe case. I don't usually use this. My understanding of when you would use this is if you had an API point that you were running a lot and you had to do get record just to check the user's role and you were running that a lot, you could just put that information in the authentication token and check it there. And that saves you from having to get that user's record to check. Now, again, because that's so quick, I believe this is just for if you had a really big application with a lot of requests, you could optimize it potentially by storing some information in the auth token. It doesn't have to be related to roles. That's just the method that I went with here. So that was the first part. The other big tool that Xano provides you with for securing your endpoints is rate limiting, which is something I only got familiar with myself recently on Xano. First point to note is that they don't include this in the agency light plan. You have to use the agency pro plan to get this. Otherwise, you'll still be able to see rate limiting, but you won't be able to drag it in as a function. Essentially, what rate limiting is going to let us do is it's going to let us put a cap on how often an endpoint can be hit. So if we go into API, and this one is very simple, it's just purely for the purpose of demonstrating rate limiting. All this does is it creates a new user. It takes an email and a password. It does the rate limiting, and then it adds the record. This doesn't even check that there isn't an existing user with the email. This is just, purely you hit this endpoint, it creates a user in the database. In the function stack, we have the option to put in this item, this function, rate limit. And that looks a little bit like this. So the key is going to be the identifier, I guess is maybe the word for this endpoint, the thing that we want to track and that we want to limit. And in this case, it's the user's IP address. And the way we access that is under env, which is where we can store things like API keys or information that we want to use throughout the project. We have remote IP, which we will pop in like so. And that is going to be the IP address of the requesting user. So if I'm logging in or I'm trying to create an account, whatever IP address I'm accessing it from is what's going to be rate limited here. Max is the number of requests that we can make inside this TTL, this time to live. So any given IP address can only make 5 requests to this endpoint every 60 seconds. And if they bypass that, we're going to return this error. So over in Wized, I have a request. I have a very simple registration page. And all it does is it takes the email and the password. Not reset password. Here we go. So I'm just going to type in an email and a password here. And I'm going to run the request a couple of times in quick succession. 3, 4, 5, 6. You have made too many requests. So we're going to get an error. OK is going to be false. Status is going to be 429. And then we can also add in our message here, which displays on the front end. So Xano is going to handle everything else. Xano is going to keep track of this. Once that 60 seconds is up, I will be able to go back in. If I try again, not going to work. So we still want to secure our application from not necessarily being hacked, people going in and, getting access to the data or the database. We also don't want them to be able to just mess with it. So without that rate limit, if someone finds this, they can access this through Postman. As we've looked at, they don't need to use your Wized account. They can pop that URL in here and they could just keep hitting it. Now, on most websites, it's going to check. And, if I tried this on most sites, it's going to say an account with this email already exists. For a hacker, it's not too much extra work to just create a different email every time that they run this. And they could set up a script where they run it and they're just adding users to your database. And you might sign on to work one day and your client says, hey, our database storage has jumped from 20% full to 80% full. Could you take a look? And you might go in and find that there's 1 million new users in your database because the endpoint wasn't rate limited. Now, again, on the couple of early web apps that I launched, some of which got quite a lot of traffic, this just never happened. I got lucky. But I've now started implementing this on all my projects because you just never know when someone's going to find it. So before you put your project live, go through all your API endpoints, every single one of them, and look at each one. Does it have authentication enabled? If not, should it have authentication enabled? Sometimes you might have endpoints that you aren't actually going to use in Wized that are just for some admin functionality. Go into those and go into settings and turn off external access. If they don't need external access, turn it off. Don't let people access it. Then authentication might be needed, might not be needed. And then rate limiting, typically needed on endpoints that aren't authenticated. But you might still want to stop a user from being able to register, log in, and spam an endpoint. You just need to work out what's a reasonable number of requests for a user to make. If you have some sort of endpoint that users do need to check regularly, you might have to increase that max of 5 up to 500 or 5,000. It depends on what it is. So just go through each endpoint, be smart about it, think it through. Do we need to access it externally? Do we need authentication? Do we need any role-based checks or preconditions to check that users have a particular role? And how can we rate limit our API endpoints? And ask that for all of them, check them, test them, make sure that the web app that you're going to build is rock solid and that no one can jimmy their way in the back door. So that's it, folks. That is securing endpoints in Xano. So very briefly, just to recap, we touched on the terminology, what an API is, what a REST API is, and then Xano API endpoints specifically. Security for web apps, whether you're building them for yourself, internally, or for a client, own the security. You're in charge of it, so look after it. Be proactive. Don't set up your security after there's been a security event or security breach. Be on top of it. And then be aware. Just remember that every time you make an endpoint that's public, anyone from anywhere in the world can access it at any time. Then over in Xano, we looked at changing an endpoint from public to making it authenticated. We looked at disabling or enabling external access. We looked at rate limiting, and we looked at authentication tokens, how we can store the user's role and how we can use those to check a user's role from the database. Again, if you are struggling with anything in Xano or with the WWX stack in general, if there's anything that you're curious about, any roadblocks that you're having, or just questions in general, let us know about those. We're always looking for content to do, and we're always looking to help people to use Xano and to overcome hurdles. So any particular issue that you're having, send it in. If there's a pattern, if a couple of people are having that issue or request a particular topic, we can cover that for sure. And that brings today's session to an end. So very briefly, we touched on what APIs are. We looked at REST APIs and API endpoints in Xano. We looked at how we can disable external access on endpoints, enable and disable user authentication, and how to use the authenticating user's ID inside of functions, along with the precondition to check if users have a particular role. And we also looked briefly at rate limiting and how to use that to protect our endpoints. So thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video if you found it interesting. And as always, we love to hear your feedback, your comments, what you liked or didn't like, as well as suggestions for any future videos you'd like to see. If there's something you're struggling with in Wized or Xano, do let us know in the comment. And if there's enough interest in it, we can cover that in a future video. Until then, keep having fun with Webflow.